Hello and welcome to the Climate Resilience Podcast, brought to you by JBA Consulting. I'm Phil Emonson, and in this podcast series, we unpick some of the complexities, challenges and opportunities on the topic of climate resilience with some inspirational thought leaders. Whether you're working on local adaptation projects, planning for climate risk, or simply looking for hope backed by science, you're in the right place. If you enjoy these conversations, be sure to follow the podcast and subscribe wherever you listen. Share with your friends and colleagues too, anyone interested in building a more resilient future. Now, let's jump into today's episode. Today's episode comes to you at a fascinating moment. I'm joined by David Hodcroft, who is Head of Strategic Infrastructure at the Greater Manchester Combined Authority. And he's joining me fresh out from JBA's latest Climate Resilience Exchange Roundtable, held this afternoon on the eve of the annual Flood and Coast Conference in Liverpool. The event is the fourth session in our series of roundtables, and today cross-sector leaders from industry and academia have been diving deep into the UK's 10-year infrastructure strategy. And they've been discussing how to turn ambition into action, how to advance system-wide climate resilience, how to embed integrated catchment thinking, and how to strengthen the link between national investment and community-level outcomes. And it builds on the calls from our previous roundtables for cross-sector governance reform and socially inclusive approaches. Many of these conversations will move to centre stage in the coming days at Flood and Coast. So this feels like the perfect time to take stock whilst these ideas are still fresh. So whether you're heading to Flood and Coast or just trying to make sense of where resilience fits in the national infrastructure agenda, this is a really timely conversation. So David, I'm delighted to have you on the podcast this afternoon. Welcome. And perhaps you could start by introducing yourself.
Thank you, Phil. Great to be here. Thanks for my introduction in terms of my job title. So I am Head of Strategic Infrastructure at the Combined Authority. I am a town planner by background. So my work essentially centres around providing the strategic context of infrastructure planning and delivery for the Combined Authority, and how we kind of work together with our partners across the utility sector to make sure it is aligned to the Greater Manchester strategy, our integrated pipeline, and how we try and work through some of that complexity of the government funding arrangements and those the governance arrangements as well. So happy to be here.
Super, thank you. And some of those things about working with partners and getting your heads around the complexity of it, I'm sure were on the table in this afternoon's Climate Resilience Exchange. So I'm sure we'll get into that. So as I said, you've come straight out of the roundtable. So tell me about it. Who was in the room? What sectors were represented? What were your immediate reactions? And what were the sort of headlines that you discussed?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of the sectors who were there, so obviously I think I was unique. I think I was on a mayoral combined authority in the room. We did have the leads on flooding from Leeds City Council. Consultancies were represented, the Environment Agency. We had people there from the energy sector, academia, and some of the technical consultancy sectors. So if we just jump across to some of the main conclusions we came out from the meeting itself. Uh-huh. So we did have we talked around, there were some key headlines takeaway. That was having a clear purpose. You have a purpose of where you're going and your vision and your direction. Needs for some accountability and scrutiny and ownership. One of the other key threads was around value-based decision-making, integrated infrastructure investment programs and having the right incentives, delivery at the right spatial scale, depending on what particular infrastructure asset or system you're talking about. And we did conclude that there is actually some good practice out there across the country. Sometimes it may not be communicated what the good practice is, but there is some good practice to share. We did, one of the key points as well was around the key role for NISTA and NISTA deploying its convening power. We talked around using some sandboxes to try and work together and collaborate. And then the conclusion was he wanted to kind of develop a collective problem statement, which really was one of the outcomes from the meeting today. So hopefully that kind of gives you a summary of what we agreed right at the end. But yeah, happy to go into some of those questions in more detail.
Excellent. Thank you. And NISTA being the National Infrastructure and Service Transformation Authority, the sort of government agency, government authority there. Fabulous. So look, let's take it then almost section by section as you went through the meeting. Good to have those headlines laid out there. I think the first topic of discussion for the group this afternoon was around integrated systems thinking. So we have the 10-year infrastructure strategy, a lot of detail in that. We had David Porter actually on the podcast a few episodes ago, who's president of the ICE, talking about the ICE's State of the Nation report, which is their reaction and response to the 10-year infrastructure strategy. So that was great. But this first question then was around integrated systems thinking. And I suppose specifically the governance, the regulatory, the institutional changes that we need to see so that we can get clear ownership of cross-sector infrastructure. You mentioned, David, there, one of the headlines was around, who should be accountable. Who should be accountable for managing and funding and delivering resilience. So what was discussed in that first thematic session?
Yeah, sure. Just go through some of the headline words which were talked about. So again, the word resilience was clearly mentioned. Systems thinking, good growth was mentioned. The words of resilience, reliability, and recovery, climate change, adaptation. There's a point made that resilience is everyone's responsibility, but no one's accountable for that. We did also talk around the strategy itself and what a strategy means. And we did also talk through that actually plans are worthless, but planning is everything. So we're saying actually a plan is good because it gives you the direction where you want to go to, but it doesn't give you any certainty because there is always change happening, whether it's global events or local events or political change. But the process of having a plan helps organizations understand what they're working towards and how they're going to communicate with the different stakeholders and partners. And then we also talked around outcomes, the whole system approach, how we build back better. We talked about extreme weather, but actually we talked about just the usual weather and growth dynamics as well, the shocks and capacity of the system to adapt to that change. We also highlighted some of the biggest opportunities in terms of aligning place outcomes, what that means at a geographical scale. So we're talking through, again, what is the right appropriate scale. So clearly if you're delivering a railway scheme and it's across the whole of the country, then it should be a national issue. But then there are certain areas where it does come down to scrutiny and accountability. And then again, I could talk through my own experience was where mayoral combined authorities do have a integrated settlement. A lot of that is public funding from the taxpayer, but also the utility companies are utilizing funding from the bill payer. So how do you bring these elements together collectively to deliver those outcomes? And then was also talking through, well, how do we know what resilience actually means at the right spatial scale? Because it is complex.
Yeah.
So even working through the stakeholders, we did highlight there is the government departments elements. Again, this is why the NIST element came in national strategy, because we're talking through, well, there are multiple government departments involved in infrastructure planning, but also in resilience. There is a separate regulatory element to that. And then there are the individual organizations. So how do you bring those together at the right spatial scale to understand what is the baseline you're working towards? What information do you have? What outcomes are you trying to achieve? Where do you make those trade-offs? Who determines where those trade-offs happen? What is a longer term outcome you're trying to make and to work through? And all that does need facilitating and translating collectively. So again, the phrase was used around, we do need a common purpose to drive that delivery. And you need to clarify that common purpose. Otherwise, you can't really work together. You're not sure why you're working together. And you need a mechanism to bring everybody together on the same page, so you're clear who is actually doing what bits of activity to move forward those actions. And then the definitions that we did talk through around how you measure the outcome, and there's a different scale of granularity, whether it's national or it's sub-regional. And then we really did pivot against some clear outcomes linked to society, the environment, and the economy, with some clear messaging. And I think that the right spatial scale was a really key point, which was mentioned quite a few times. So again, concluding the question one, it was outcomes, timescales of what period of time we're working to, what's the baseline position, how do you communicate that position. Data was mentioned repeatedly about how you bring information and data together at the right spatial scale, and how do you communicate and convene the right individuals and the actors together at that scale.
Great. So something you've alluded to there is who is responsible, who is accountable for resilience, right? And something we've spoken about a lot on this podcast is resilience by its nature involves the breaking down of silos. It is multi-sectoral, and as evidenced by the many varied voices and sectors that you had represented in the room today. I'm going to quote two previous podcast guests now. Firstly, Lena Laiku, who was on around January time, who's the managing director of the Resilient Cities Network. And on LinkedIn, just literally in the last couple of days, she's put out a statement. But within that, she says that resilience is never built by one person or one organisation. It's built through trust, shared learning, partnerships, and people willing to work across silos. Okay, and I'll also quote John O'Brien, who is the founder of the Anthropy Gathering down in Cornwall, and their strapline is "Leave your ego and silo at the door." So we've got this thing, right, about breaking out of your silos, right, and I think that is representative of the resilience dialogue. This idea of full cross-sectoral partnership working, and working through the complexities of it, with all of your stakeholders. So I'm really interested, David, from sort of your work in GMCA, just a little bit. So I've just got one sort of inserted question here, which is, and it's not meant to be a trick question. I'm genuinely interested. Who would you say is responsible and accountable for resilience in GMCA and the work that you do in infrastructure planning?
Again, from a GMCA perspective, again, it is one of those words where it is in our corporate strategy, and we will say it is a cross-cutting aim, because we do want to be stronger to shocks and stresses. But also, again, this is part of what we're talking through in the round table. I was saying, actually, we do have in Greater Manchester, we have a resilience forum, which is traditionally an emergency planning response.
The local resilience forum, the
local
LRS,
resilience forum, but the LRS, and they want to push the agenda for just being them at the end of the issue, making it truly a cross-cutting issue. But then the risk is it becomes like saying climate adaptation is everyone's responsibility. It becomes a responsibility of everybody, but actually no one's accountable for this. So all I can say is, from a GMCA perspective, we do have a strategic infrastructure board, and resilience is one of our cross-cutting themes. So we do bring together the main infrastructure providers, and how we then communicate and work together on what our shared priorities and issues are, and how we do convene those organisations together and try and give them that shared purpose, where we do have a clear aim collectively to work together. And I think another point was mentioned. I think they were saying teams do. And again, the representatives from today, they were talking about who their professional organisation is, whether it's the Institute of Civil Engineers, it's CIWEM and Town Planning. The individual professionals do want to work together out of their silos, but unless you give them a framework within which they can operate, they will naturally kind of work in their silos. So I think I don't want to say any more, because we picked up some of this under question 2. Around how you turn strategy into delivery.
Well, let's segue into question two then, David. So, it was as you've just said, the second question of the afternoon for you was, yeah, it was focused on how do you turn strategy into local delivery. I think specifically, what delivery models, funding mechanisms, and governance arrangements are needed to scale local catchment infrastructure solutions as national delivery frameworks. So, how do you ensure consistency in community resilience outcomes? So, again, David, really interested in your reflections and the outcomes and outputs from the group this afternoon.
I think what I was just looking at my notes here, we did write down clarity on a deadline. So we're talking about the Olympic Village in London. So we say the Olympic Village was clearly delivered because there was a burning platform of a deadline to meet. So the individual organisations did come together with a purpose to achieve something at a spatial scale. And you can see how, from a Great Manchester perspective, we are trying to deliver the same approach by having a 10-year integrated pipeline. We have geographical location where we're trying to deliver growth and development, housing, skills, employment, integrate the transport system into that geographical space, using mayoral development corporations as a delivery vehicle. So again, it was coming down to that point as well. It was clarity on a deadline, but also responsibilities, who is responsible and who is accountable for delivering those the actions, the outputs. But also, one of the examples mentioned was during the COVID pandemic, there was a Nightingale hospital which did get delivered. But I think the conclusion from those examples we're saying nationally we're great at responding to a crisis. We're not that great historically at actually working together, trying to deliver something outside of a crisis. So how do you provide that same energy and direction as a country to outline these are the infrastructure outcomes to achieve at different geographical scales, and how do you create that sense of urgency to make sure we are delivering on the ground as well? And I think the second point linked to that was the question raised was who is looking across the system. So who in government looking across the system? And that's why it went back to the national infrastructure strategy, because really we're saying the individual government departments, the individual regulators look at the world through their lens, but it's really only NISTA who were looking at that system as a whole. So there's lots of discussion around systems planning and how we actually map out the system we're actually working in to identify where's the main leverage point, who are the main actors that need to be engaged, how do you link all that to a coherent evidence base?
That's very interesting, because actually, if you were to look at, let's take the flood and water sector for example, actually, it's hugely fragmented, even in terms of its sort of funding cycles, right? So some of the flood and coastal strategic long-term frameworks are out with the water company AMP cycles. So actually, you've got different time horizons that different regulators, different operators, different actors are working to. So that immediately puts different. You're talking about that, creating that sense of urgency to an immovable deadline. Well, actually, that's quite tricky. Where actually all these different regulators and operators have got their own different time horizons that they're working to.
That is true.
It's really fascinating. I know there are probably very good reasons why you perhaps can't align some of those, but actually from the outside looking in, you say, well, surely we can try and align some of these sort of long-term funding horizons so that actually we can dovetail on some of the major infrastructure strategies and funding cycles, because that's only going to benefit our partners, our stakeholders, the contractors, etc. You mentioned there then, so who is looking across the system, and you came back to NISTA. And I think I sort of interjected there, but tell me a little bit more about what the group felt the role of NISTA could be in this space then.
I think the group felt at a national scale, NISTA could help convene the relevant organizations together or even share good practice. Like I said earlier on, there is some good practice out there, but it's probably not being communicated enough, or it's happening on a kind of ad hoc basis. So again, at one scale, we were talking about the national infrastructure pipeline. So at least nationally, you can see there is the industrial strategy. The infrastructure strategy is trying to align the infrastructure requirements to the industrial strategy to create the growth across the country. The national pipeline is at least going some way to give the market some visibility of current committed infrastructure projects. But as a picking up the point you mentioned around how you incentivize organizations to work together. So
Yeah.
those individual cycles will always be, they'll never be aligned, but we talked around incentives.
Right.
So there were two examples we did talk about. So one example was United Utilities are working with Network Rail to see if they could utilize some of their assets to manage surface water. So
Right.
that's not the role of Network Rail to manage surface water, but clearly there's a shared outcome at geographical scale. We also talked about United Utilities through one of their funding programs are being treated by Ofwat as a national pilot linked to rainwater management funding to deploy
Mm.
nature-based solutions to get water out of UU system because that delivers a reduction on the spill of the outfall, but it delivers wider benefits and wider values if you can link it to growth, transport, economic development. And also, I referred to there is an incentive that's been applied to Cadence via what's called GD3, which is Gas Distribution Level 3 from April this year. And that's the Collaborative Streetworks incentive. So that's where Cadence, they can claim an incentive if they collaborate with one of the utility company to collaborate on their streetworks.
Right.
So that it's a social value metric which covers sustainable drainage systems, less disruption. It could be skills created, air quality improvements. So the point we're making is if you set the incentive within the regulatory framework, that should then incentivize those organizations to collaborate together at the right spatial scale. If you're clear on what your outcome is based on your baseline, will that then incentivize the utilities to work together? I can only speak for myself, but at a mayoral combined authority scale, we'd want to work together to deliver. We've got integrated pipeline and integrated settlement for the government with outcome metrics that the government, as we've agreed with the government, then clearly it makes sense for another parts of the government to be aligning the metrics from the regulatory side to help integrate some of that investment so we can deliver wider benefits and impact at the right spatial scale.
That's fantastic. That's a really interesting model. Using incentives, as you say, it sort of becomes a sort of social value exercise or initiative, but embedding that in the regulatory framework as a way to get partnership, working, collaboration. You mentioned their outcome metrics, which is something we might come back to in a little while, because I'm really interested in what good looks like and how we how we ensure community climate resilience outcomes that we can justify. But I'm going to move us into the third and final topic of your conversation with the roundtable this afternoon, which I suppose in some ways is related actually to that point, because it was about how measurable and system-wide resilience outcomes can be defined and indeed mandated if that is possible. So yeah, talk to me about this third question then, David.
Yeah.
Let's talk around that.
Yeah, so I think the third question it did move on from the previous conversation. We did go back to the early conversations as well. So we're talking about the exam question was centered on asset classes.
Right.
So again, it brought us lots of asset management discussion. So asset management, individual organizations manage their assets individually.
Yeah.
And I think there was an early conversation where we did talk about, do we even know where our assets are? What information and data do we have? So there's reference to Daphne, if anyone's heard of that. So it's a data and analytics facility for national infrastructure. So the conversation was, do we know where assets are? Do we know how our assets are at a spatial scale? What systems do we utilize to understand where assets are? Do we know how our assets perform? What thresholds are they using? There's a discussion looking at climate change projections and what they mean for assets, metrics, and how I measure all this. We did talk about the National Underground Asset Register is a register of, as the name says, underground assets.
Yeah.
Lots of the partners on the table have put their assets into the register, but the new R is used for strike avoidance, but could it be used for something broader? And then we're talking through, well, at a play scale, there'll be assets in there from the environment agency, the water company, the digital, etc., the local authorities, but there is no understanding at the moment how we look at those assets collectively, which then makes it more difficult if you haven't defined what your outcome is for resilience at the play scale.
Yeah.
You don't know where your assets are. You don't know what your baseline is. How do you then achieve the outcome? How do you know what you're working towards? So what metrics are you working on collectively? There was a discussion regarding how do we measure progress. So there's a reference to adaptation pathways. Could that be one way to do this? So you set your longer term goal, but you're kind of checking in on how the process is going, and you are adapting as more information comes on board.
Yep.
But it really kind of came down to the first question around what is the baseline, what's the risk, what's the impact, and we're talking through different parts of the country are clearly start from different positions. So if you're in the Oxcam corridor, there's clearly different issues and drivers than whether or not you're in Greater Manchester or Merseyside.
Yeah. A hugely fascinating topic, this one. I mean, we could talk about this all day.
Yes.
And we've touched on it in many previous episodes of the podcast. How do we measure resilience progress? And I've seen many models trying to explain this. It can turn into a game of 3D chess if you're not careful. Quite simply because climate resilience means different things to different stakeholders, different organizations. So actually tying down a unique set of definitions and then downstream from that, a standardized set of indicators, metrics, is really tricky. I know organizations have done it for their own purpose, but it remains deeply sort of under discussion still. In JBA, we have 5 resilience themes, and these are resilient people, resilient places, resilient assets, resilient organizations, and resilient landscapes. And that defines the outcomes from the work that we all do in JBA. So whether you're a flood modeler, whether you're a design engineer for a flood defence scheme, whether you work in sustainable drainage, property flood resilience, or even the environmental sector, so ecology, river restoration, etc. Our resilience definitions and how we measure progress in JBA is through those five pillars: people, places, assets, landscapes, and organisations. But we're very different from GMCA, and we're very different in turn from Network Rail. So it's really it's hugely complex. How is progress measured in GMCA, David, and what does good resilience look like in GMCA?
Well, I could tell you what we actually did talk around. We came down to at the end we talked about social value.
Yeah.
So that is a key thing we do measure in the command authority, and that seems to be a common theme. So we're talking through each individual, the utility companies and those around the table talk about social value is a key element. So it's not just about delivering infrastructure, tick a box saying that's great infrastructure. How many jobs being created? What's the wider environment improvement being created? So we talked around Tom's metrics. Someone was mentioned that, which is like themes, outcome measurements, and standards.
Yep.
But also, it's like, how are you going to communicate this to the public? How will it make their life better and different? So that's what really came up to be social value, but also the group was talking through insurance companies now looking for costs, and not the cost, but the benefits and common value framework. So there's reference to as a common value framework for the water sector has been produced as a bit of a draft to work through. But again, it was noted that this is a common value framework for the water sector. So not necessarily a common value framework for the water sector and others, but there seems to be clearly some traction in working through what are the social benefits to communities by working together and collaborate. So how will they know and feel and understand there are tangible benefits to their life from these multi-billion-pound investment programs? And they actually want to know, the residents and the local community want to know that we are actually collaborating together to deliver these benefits, not working in isolation.
Right.
Because ultimately, like we start the call today, is bill payers, taxpayer, it is the general public paying for all this.
Yeah. I really like that idea of using social value as a means, as a method to describe those resilient outcomes at a place. And going back to the point you made earlier about, aligning place-based outcomes. I mean, ultimately, resilience is nothing if it's not going to improve the lives and livelihoods of people and place. So actually, social value is a really good indicator of that in terms of well-being, jobs, social capital, etc. So it's a really nice way of doing that. I think there's a lot of work to be done still on that. David, this is great. Really interested in seeing behind the curtain of this roundtable today. It was an invite-only event, so it's really great that we can share the discussions that happened. We're sort of getting towards the end of the episode, but I'm really interested if there was one main takeaway that you're going to take from the event today and your participation in it. What would that be?
I'd go back to the first point I said right at the beginning. It's clarity of purpose. Sorry, maybe 1 or 2, 3 points. It's clarity of purpose, a clear evidence base of an outcome, and you do need some organisation. I can say this from a GMCA perspective, who convenes the right partners together to give them that, to agree this is our common purpose, this is the baseline, and we're going to bring together individual organisations together and to have that common value framework and drive forwards into that, making sure we are delivering on the ground.
Brilliant. So there you are. Those are the concluding remarks. Clarity of purpose, clear outcome, and a convening potential to bring the right bodies together. This has been a fascinating conversation. I've really enjoyed it. David, I know you're heading to Flooding Coast tomorrow. We're recording this on Monday afternoon. I know you're heading there tomorrow, so I hope you have a good few days at conference. David Hodcroft, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, Phil. Good stuff.
So we've reached the end of our time today. If you've enjoyed listening, please hit the subscribe button so you're ready for our next episode in a month's time. And if you'd like to support the show, consider sharing it with others or leaving us a short review wherever you're listening. It really helps more people to discover and enjoy the podcast. Thanks for joining us. I'm Phil Emonson, and you've been listening to the Climate Resilience Podcast, brought to you by JBA Consulting.